Welcome back to Philosophy of Mind. Today we return to the hard problem, but with a materialist twist. Anil Seth's video gives a good sense of how his predictive processing theory accounts for phenomenal consciousness, which is the consciousness at issue in the hard problem. If you haven't watched his video, I recommend that you do that before you watch this video. I'm going to give you an explanatory account of his view, and it would be good to hear Seth talk about what's intuitively compelling about the theory before you get into the more critical technical analysis. We'll start with Chalmers and the hard problem, which is where any good explanation ought to begin. As you know, zombies are physically and behaviorally indistinguishable from you. There is nothing it is like to be a zombie. Zombies are not conscious. The hard problem for scientists is to say why zombies are impossible, because if something is physically and behaviorally just like you, it ought to be conscious if it is a material physical thing. So that's the scientist problem. For dualists, there is no explanation of the hard problem. There is just consciousness, and consciousness is extra. So, here's Dave, and he's conscious, and zombie Dave, behaviorally and physically identical to Dave, but zombie Dave is unconscious. So for the dualist, zombie Dave is possible. For the scientist, zombie Dave is impossible. Remember, for the eliminativist, zombie Dave is also impossible, but they have a reason that there is nothing to consciousness above and beyond the other easy problems of consciousness. Things like attention, memory, perception, that's just all there is for the eliminativist. So the eliminativist doesn't have the additional problem of the scientist of trying to explain phenomenal consciousness in material scientific terms, okay? So different responses to the hard problem. Keep track of these three different responses and try to figure out which one makes the most sense to you and why. Seth is a scientist, but he thinks that more progress can be made on consciousness if we put the hard problem aside. Instead of trying to explain why zombies are impossible, Seth argues that we should account for the various properties of consciousness in terms of biological mechanisms. That is, scientists should work on the easy problems, and this is what we talked about with respect to the scientist response. Work on the easy problems, and then eventually we should be able to solve the hard problem. This, he says, is the real problem of consciousness. The real problem is the one the scientists are working on right now, which is how do we account for various properties of consciousness in terms of biological mechanisms. So Seth then goes on to distinguish three different aspects of consciousness and considers research that applies to each aspect. The conscious level is from sleep to wakefulness. Conscious contents are what you are conscious of, so the things and feelings and thoughts that are the contents of your consciousness. And then the conscious self is the experience of being you, what it is to be a self. And we'll come back to the conscious self in week 8, so you can kind of think about this, and then we'll return to this when we get to that material. So for each of these aspects, go back to the article and look at the specific research that Seth discusses that supports his claims about the relationship between the property and the biological mechanism that relates to it. Ask yourself how these studies claim to map the property to the biological mechanism, and then in class we'll discuss this research and whether it's convincing to you. As we discussed in relation to the neural correlates of consciousness, think about what sort of brain research, if any brain research, would be sufficient to convince you that materialism is true. If no research is sufficient, then think about why not. Why do you think that dualism is true, such that consciousness has properties or is a kind of stuff that can't be explained in terms of the physical aspects of consciousness? So what is it about consciousness that seems to escape the physical explanations? In discussing research on the conscious level of consciousness, the difference between deep sleep and alert wakefulness, Seth considers the information integration theory of consciousness. This is the view that the quality and quantity of consciousness can be measured by a formula or a set of formulas. Consciousness is the information carried by a particular brain state and the integration of information contents. The definition of information as the reduction of uncertainty is probably not a familiar idea to you, but it's a widely used definition in science. The idea is that you can quantify the amount of information carried by a signal in terms of the number of possible states that's ruled out by that signal. In a simple case, a light switch carries one bit of information because there are two possible states, either it's on or it's off. So the light is on, so we know that it's not off. So we've got one bit of information that's carried by the light switch. The uniquely complex sensory and cognitive state that your brain is in right now carries an enormous amount of information because it rules out all the other possible combinations of information that your brain state might convey. So even from minute to minute, your brain is carrying different bits of information. So you are thinking about one word that I'm saying right now, and then maybe your brain's wandering to think about something else, and then you think about another word that I'm saying. So, each time, even if you replayed this video over and over again, which I recommend, you wouldn't be getting the exact same bit of information. Your brain would be in a slightly different state. So that information can be quantified, and also the different qualities of information are involved. So, seeing blue or thinking about lunch, these are all different contents that are carried by your brain state right now. They're all different kinds of bits of information. But a lot of information is not enough to be conscious unless that information is integrated. Your brain has to be able to connect those bits together in order to use them effectively and in order to be, the exact kind of information that is carried by your brain right now. You're now having an experience of the sound of my voice and what I look like, and all of that is part of what your brain state is doing right now, the information that your brain state is carrying right now. So it's all got to be the information, but then also integrated. So look in the article for the studies that suggest that quantifying integrated information is a good measure for consciousness. So Seth is recommending information integration in terms of giving us some science that measures this quantity, this level of consciousness. But Seth also thinks that it's problematic for the information integration theory to try to answer the hard problem. He says that the claim that information integration is consciousness is problematic because it has the problematic consequence that small bits of integrated information count as a small bit of consciousness. So this is the idea of panpsychism, that every bit of information is a bit of consciousness. So the light switch is integrated. It carries information. It's integrated because it's one bit, so there's nothing else to it, and it carries some information. So it would be a small bit of consciousness. And this seems implausible, and there are other more complex bits of structures of integrated information. So he talks about the cerebellum, which is the back of your brain, as carrying a lot of information. It's not integrated with the rest of the system, but it's integrated within itself, but it doesn't count as conscious because it's not the maximum amount of integrated information. It's not as well integrated it's not integrated sufficiently with the rest of the brain. So, there are various problems with the view of integrated information as an answer to the hard problem, but Seth wants to recommend integrated information as one of the measures, as capturing one of the aspects of consciousness, even if it doesn't solve the hard problem in total. In discussing research on conscious contents, what you're conscious of at this moment, Seth considers his own predictive processing theory as an account of what those contents are. On his view, perception is a matter of generating predictions about what you expect to see. According to Seth, what you're conscious of, the contents of your conscious experience, is what you predict to be in the world. You don't actually experience the world itself, you experience your predictions of the world. Sensory input then generates prediction errors to revise your hypotheses. So you're still in contact with the world through the revisions that your sensory input provides. So if your prediction is wildly mistaken, then the next moment's prediction is revised and you get a revised sense of what's out there in the world. So instead of a person, you realize you're actually seeing a bush, but you're still seeing your prediction, never the bush directly. You're seeing the bush a moment afterwards once the sensory input has created a revision to your prediction, and then the prediction gives you a new sense of what's in the world. So consciousness, according to Seth, is a controlled hallucination. You're hallucinating your world just the way you do in a dream or in a drug-induced hallucination, except those cases are not appropriately revised by your sensory input. They're over-confirming, you're over-confirming, over-eager to confirm the hypothesis. And so you don't take new information in order to revise your prediction, and so your predictions just go wild. But normal perception is also hallucination. You're not seeing the world, you're seeing your prediction of the world. And in a normal case, that gets revised based on the world, and so you stay in touch with reality. So think about this. Is this reasonable to you as explaining the contents of your consciousness? Do you think that when you're experiencing me right now, you're experiencing your prediction of me, or are you experiencing me in some more direct sense? And if you think it's the first, then that suggests that you're on board with the predictive processing theory account. If you think that you're experiencing me more directly, then there's something wrong. And so try to think about what that is. Is there an objection that you can formulate to the predictive processing theory account of conscious contents based on what seem to be the contents of your experience? And then we'll talk about this in class to kind of think about how the real problem is different from or similar to the hard problem, and whether Seth's account gives us a sense that materialism might be true.